Did you know that even John Shakespeare, William Shakespeare's dad, ended up getting in trouble with essentially the early modern version of the HOA? He got in trouble for having too much trash in his yard. You want to know the full story? Let's find out right now on That Shakespeare Life. In 1552, John Shakespeare was fined for keeping a dung heap too close to his house in Stratford upon Avon. So, a dung heap is exactly what it sounds like. It's a big pile of, we'll go with refuse just to keep the nasty words out of our conversation today. But it's a big mess outside of his house. And at the time, there were laws in Stratford upon Avon that required waste to be disposed of in a certain way because piles of refuse spread disease and they stink and they're nasty and people don't want them close to where they live. It's a vivid reminder that even prominent families like the Shakespeares would have been at this time, they weren't above local regulations. And that sanitation was a major issue in Tudor towns. To learn more about waste, cleanliness, and daily life in Shakespeare's England, I spoke with Elizabeth Tavares. Elizabeth is an assistant professor at the University of Alabama. Roll Tide. She's with the Hudson Strode program in Renaissance Studies, and along with David Fallow, who was a former financier who had spent years studying the Shakespeare family's wealth, Elizabeth put together a book called John Shakespeare's Muck Hill: Ecologies, Economies, and Biographies of Communal Waste in Stratford upon Avon. Now, she focused on 1550 to 1600 with that project. But inside this project, she discovered that the history of the public sanitation practices in Stratford upon Avon kind of changes the way that we look at John Shakespeare specifically and what we should think about this fine, because a lot of times John Shakespeare gets some flack for having gotten in trouble with the law over this dung heap. And so when she was doing her research along with Professor Fallow here, or I don't know if David's actually a professor, but anyway, he was doing research into this too. They put it together that there was just a little bit of a different twist on this story. So, to find out what she discovered and exactly what we should think about this situation, I sat down and spoke with her about their research and what they found out. Here's what she had to say.
Yeah, it's really unclear. The word fine it doesn't isn't exclusively punitive as it is today. It's got like this real punitive resonance. And medieval scholars I've talked to who work in a wide variety of fields are like, yeah, it's more of a fee, but we don't have a good translation. I think we just don't have a really good equivalency for what that is doing. It's really a tool to financially manage who has the right to sell from a muck hill. It gives them a structure sort of before the borough gets incorporated. That's not to say that John Shakespeare isn't doing other salacious things in the financial record. But this one thing, again, it's also a collective fine. He's fined with two other leather workers. And this is a town of haberdashers and milliners and drapers and dyers. It's all these people who really work with leather goods and fabrics, right? So it makes sense that they would really care about this resource and need it for the sort of artisanal trade of the town. But yeah, it's probably more likely based on like the next several decades of rent rolls, the system they kind of had in place before you could really sort of have that privilege. And eventually the city just takes it over entirely. And instead of paying someone else, they just collect all the revenue because that ends up being better.
From fines for dung heaps to chamber pots tossed into the street, Shakespeare grew up in a world where sanitation shaped everyday life. It certainly didn't look exactly like what we think of today, but a lot of things were surprisingly similar. For more on this fascinating topic, you can listen to our entire episode with Elizabeth on the podcast, and I will place a link to that episode below this video. That's it for this week. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye bye.